in an enchanted realm. An oddity stirs, beckoning the curious. Meet Jessii, once ensnared, now awakened, waiting to be yours.
So back in 1663, the term jack-o'-lantern was actually used to describe a person and not pumpkins. The term was used to refer to a man with a lantern or a night watchman. So basically back in that time, if you ever saw a man walking around at night holding a lantern in his hands, you'd be like, oh, that man is a jack-o'-lantern. Doesn't really make sense to us now, but it did to them back then. But then at some point in the 1700s, the term jack-o'-lantern began to be used to refer to the mysterious lights sometimes seen at night over bogs, swamps, and marshes. These ghost lights are also called will-o'-the-wisps and are created when gases from decomposing plant matter ignite as they come into contact with electricity or heat as they oxidize. So people would literally be walking along at night and would see this sinister glow over swamps. And for centuries before the scientific reason for this happening was known, people would tell these crazy stories and legends about what it actually was. So back in the 1500s in Ireland, those stories always revolved around a guy named Jack, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So here is the legend of Jack. And like I said, this legend goes far back into Irish history. The story goes that there was this man named Jack who was known as a trickster. He loved to play pranks on his mom, his sisters, his friends, his family, and everyone was just so tired of it. Because his pranks were never funny, they were often cruel. One night, he went to his favorite pub and sat beside an evil spirit. And the evil spirit offered to buy Jack a drink in exchange for his soul. Jack agreed to this, and the spirit turned itself into a coin to pay for the drinks. But because Jack was such a trickster, Jack stole back the coin and put it in his pocket beside a cross necklace. And the cross kept the spirit from changing back into his regular form. Jack said he would only let the spirit free if he promised to not take Jack's soul. So the spirit agreed and was freed, because obviously this evil spirit didn't want to stay in a coin form forever. Well, many years later, Jack died and went up to the gates of heaven, but wasn't allowed in because he was a very cruel man. So yeah, he was a pretty terrible man and didn't care for anybody else but himself. So he wasn't allowed into heaven. But the problem was, he also wasn't allowed to go to the bad place down under, because that spirit promised him he wouldn't take his soul. So he was stuck in the netherworld in between both of these places, doomed to walk the earth by himself. Now this netherworld, or the in-between that he was stuck in, was pitch black. So he asked the evil spirit if he could have a light that he could carry around with him. So the spirit tossed him some embers from a flame, and Jack had a turnip with him since it was one of his favorite foods. So he hollowed out this turnip and put the light inside of it. And from that day forward, Jack roamed the earth without a resting place, with only his dim turnip lighting the way. And that's how the story goes, and that's how it's been told for many, many years. Now, I had no idea, but the original jack-o'-lantern wasn't made out of a pumpkin, but it was actually made out of a turnip. And that is because pumpkins did not exist in Ireland. So ancient Celtic cultures in Ireland carved turnips on All Hallows Eve and placed an ember in them to ward off evil spirits. But years and years after doing this, upon their arrival in the New World, they realized that pumpkins were so much easier to carve, so they started using those instead of the turnips. And guys, I don't even know how they managed to carve such small vegetables for so many years, because I personally even have trouble carving like a normal large pumpkin. How did they deal with these tiny little things? Like, have you guys seen the size of a turnip beside a pumpkin? It's ridiculous. But yeah, apparently the reason we put pumpkins out on our porch is to ward off any evil, because the scary faces on the pumpkins literally scare the evil spirits away. And just to add on to the story that I just told, never ever make any deals with any evil spirits, never communicate with evil, because nothing good ever comes out of it. If you look at any old legends and folk tales about people who made deals to sell their souls, nothing good comes out of it. You should always surround yourself with like good things and positivity. Like, I know a lot of the origins from Halloween come from really dark and evil places, but when I was growing up, I never associated Halloween with evil. It was always just this fun holiday that my family and I would celebrate, but we never celebrated evil. So it all depends on how you go about it. Now, through my research, I actually found an original jack-o'-lantern, literally back from like the 1800s. They kept this extremely old turnip jack-o'-lantern from 1850. It's all shriveled up and creepy looking now and has teeth and everything. Now, this is apparently kept in the Museum of Country Life in Mayo, and it just truly shows how strange they really used to look. Like, the modern pumpkins you see with like the triangle eyes and the big toothy smile, that was not how they used to look. People literally just used to carve like little circles for eyes and like a long mouth with like realistic looking teeth in it. So we've definitely made jack-o'-lanterns a lot more modern. The first date in October we're going to be talking about is October 15th. This is actually National Grouch Day, which I had no idea even existed. It's to honor the world's famous Grouch from Sesame Street. This is a day to celebrate all Grouches we know, or to embrace the Grouch that lives inside of all of us. So this is a real national holiday or celebration, and on this day it says that no one can stop us from complaining. We're allowed to do all the complaining that we want. It also says we're allowed to wallow in our misery all day on this day. And it also says this day teaches us that it's good to spend time processing our negative emotions. So when I found this day during my research, it was just so odd to me. Have you guys ever celebrated National Grouch Day? The next date we're going to be talking about is October 25th, because this is Chucky the Doll Day. And guys, I'm not making any of this up. These are real days on the calendar. There is literally a day on the calendar for the killer Chucky doll, and people celebrate him on October 25th every single year. Now, if you guys didn't know, Chucky the doll comes from a horror movie, and this movie is about this spirit that inhabits a good guy doll and continuously tries to transfer his soul from the doll to a human body. And this doll literally has the strength of a grown man. It's terrifying. Some people who celebrate this day will dress up as Chucky, they'll add more Chucky merchandise to their collection, they'll even have a Chucky movie marathon. So as you can probably tell, this day is really for die-hard fans. I've never personally celebrated this day, but if you're a huge lover of this doll, I get it. I get it. Now let's move on to a very creepy story about October 10th. There is this story about this girl who was not allowed to leave her house on this day every single year. Her mother would literally mark it down on all of their calendars so they would not forget. She would set alarms, notifications. They wanted to make sure that they were inside their house on October 10th. And if they had any plans that day, or if the girl had school that day, everything was canceled. Her mother would never tell her why they had to hide in their house on that day. She just told her daughter to stay in a room with no windows and not to answer the door no matter what. And every year as they sat hiding in the dark, they would hear their doorbell ring over and over, and would hear tapping on the windows all over their house. It was basically like something was desperately trying to get in. But by the time midnight hit on October 11th, everything would stop. No more tapping, no more doorbells, and things would essentially go back to normal. One year the mother was on a work trip, so the girl had to be home alone on this day. So her mother called her the day before on October 9th to remind her of all the rules and to warn her about how to hide, how to lock down the house. She wanted to make sure her daughter was fully prepared. Well, since this was the first time this girl had been alone on October 10th, she decided she was going to answer the door to find out who was really coming to her every single year for the past 16 years. I mean, can you really blame her though? She was so curious. The doorbell started ringing around 4 in the morning, so she slowly walked over to the door feeling a little little hesitant. She was definitely very anxious to answer it, but her curiosity took over that. So she finally found the courage to open the door. As soon as she opened it, she was face to face with this tall, gangly looking woman. She had this droopy skin all over her body and her face, and the skin was so thin that she literally resembled this skeleton. And she stood there, pointing into this girl's house with her mouth wide open, but she wasn't making a sound. The girl immediately slammed the door in fear and ran to her bedroom. She called her mother and told her what happened and demanded answers about who this creepy woman was. Her mother told her that 50 years ago, there was a mother and daughter that were living in the house before them. And on the night of October 10th, there was a terrible fire and they both perished. The police were only able to find the body of the mother and not the daughter. So every year on October 10th, the mother's spirit tries to get into the house to look for her child. That is the saddest, most creepiest story I've ever heard. Like, I feel so much sorrow for this spirit, but at the same time, I would be terrified if I was living in the house while she was trying to get in. And yeah, that's why they stay in their house on October 10th, so creepy! The last creepy thing I wanted to talk about that I found out happened in October is that Houdini died on Halloween. Now, Harry Houdini was one of history's greatest magicians, and he was known for his terrifying illusions and escape stunts. Houdini performed his most daring magic tricks right up until the week before his untimely death. Now, before I tell you guys how he died, I just want to show you some of the weirdest magic tricks he ever did, and these tricks were so dangerous. Like, he risked his life every time he did these things. He did one called the belly of the whale escape. In 1911, he was literally challenged by people to try and escape the belly of a whale while his arms and legs were tied together. So they had to find a deceased whale and then sew him into the body of the whale. And apparently it only took him 15 minutes to escape while everybody watched. And they thought it was just this amazing event, but nobody knew that Houdini actually almost completely suffocated while in the whale from the arsenic, because that was the chemical that was used to embalm this whale since it was no longer alive. He also did this needle trick where he would swallow 100 needles with a glass of water. Then he would open his mouth and show the audience that there was no needles left, and then he would slowly pull this string of needles out of his mouth. So dangerous. Oh my goodness, never do this. One of his most famous tricks is the box escape. Within 57 seconds, Houdini escaped from a heavy packing crate in New York's East River. And of course, it wouldn't be a classic Houdini trick without handcuffs, leg irons, and a crate with its lid nailed shut. Then he did a buried alive stunt, and this trick almost killed him. He was buried 6 feet under without a casket, and he struggled to dig his way to the surface and panicked when overcome by exhaustion. So he literally could not dig his way out of the ground and started to panic. So he started crying for help, and his assistants had to help dig him out. When they got to him, he was completely unconscious but somehow survived. And get this, he still performed this trick 2 more times after that. So now that you know all of the dangerous things that didn't kill him somehow, let's talk about his actual death that happened on Halloween. In 1926, Houdini was actually teaching a bunch of students in Montreal. He was showing them all of these tricks, and he told the students that his stomach muscles were so strong that they could withstand any amount of punches without injury. And because he said this, one of the students in the class went up behind him and punched him twice really hard in the back, hitting his appendix. And the student did this without warning or permission, thinking that Houdini was just telling the truth. Now, at first he felt completely fine, didn't think anything injured him, but he later had this horrible pain and actually collapsed during his next show right after the curtain closed. Physicians confirmed that the student's punches caused Houdini's appendix to burst and poison his system, and he died on October 31st. I literally had no idea that Houdini died on Halloween. That is crazy to me. And from just a punch to his back. So crazy. At some point in time, the image of a black cat with glowing eyes has become intimately associated with the Halloween holiday. Way back in the day, people used to think that black cats were extremely evil. And what's so sad and horrifying to me is that they would usually be sacrificed on October 31st. I am so glad they don't do that anymore. In the Middle Ages, it was a commonly held belief that witches could disguise themselves as black cats so they could roam freely, causing havoc and spying on people without them knowing. It's said that the story began when a black cat was seen running into a house thought to be inhabited by a witch. So because of all of those rumors, these cats began to be associated with witchcraft and evil. In fact, many witches in Europe were burned at the stake with their cat beside them because they just associated them together. And many superstitions and myths about black cats still exist to this day. So I'm going to tell you some of the most common misconceptions and myths and legends about them. People say it is bad luck for a black cat to cross your path. And honestly, any animal back in the day that had like black feathers, black fur, or anything dark associated with them, like ravens and crows, they were associated with death. So people were extremely afraid of them. People say to never turn your back on a black cat or you will be cursed. People also say that if a black cat ever jumps on your bed while you're extremely ill, that means that you will die soon. If a black cat walked onto a ship and then walked off again, the ship was doomed to sink on its next voyage. And people also say that if the cat stays on the boat the whole trip, it's good luck. In Appalachian folklore, it says that if you have a sty on your eye and you rub it with the tail of a black cat, it should make the sty go away. But to me, that just sounds like really unsanitary. They also say that if you find a single white hair on the fur of your black cat, it's a very good omen for you. In England's border countries and southern Scotland, a strange black cat on the front porch brings good fortune. And in other parts of England, a bride will have luck in her marriage if she receives a black cat as a gift. So you can really see how many superstitions there are, and that's not even all of them. But they stem from being really bad luck to really good luck. So which one is it? Black cats, in truth, are far from bad luck and evil. They are loving family friends just like any other cat. And sadly, there has been this phenomenon known as black dog syndrome. Black dog syndrome refers to a pattern that many shelter workers and adoption volunteers have noticed over the years. Adopting black dogs and cats into homes, no matter what time of year it is very difficult. And here are some theories as to why people think black dogs and cats don't get adopted very often. The first reason people think is that they don't photograph as well on adoption sites and flyers. The second reason is it is hard to discern their facial expressions and grow attached to their personality. Then it says there are negative associations with the movies and the media, like I'm just talking about right now. And it also says that people are superstitious. And that's horrible. Imagine not being adopted because people have these like preconceptions of you that aren't even true. So let's shut those down right now. Please adopt. Doesn't matter what color the animal is. I actually wanted to talk about the cats in ancient Egypt because they were treated so differently. The ancient Egyptians honored cats of every color. Cats were mighty and strong and held sacred. Family cats were adorned with jewelry and fancy collars and even had pierced ears. And if a cat died back in that time, the entire family would go into mourning. And then they would send the cat off to the next world with this huge ceremony. So for thousands of years, the cat held a position of divinity in Egypt. So let's talk about black cats and modern Halloween. Around the time of World War II, when the American tradition of Halloween as trick-or-treat time really got underway, cats became a big part of the holiday decoration. This time around, however, they were considered a good luck charm. A black cat at your door would scare away any evil critters that might come a-calling. And this kind of reminds me of how jack-o'-lanterns actually are supposed to scare away any evil spirits. Now, growing up, my family actually had this black cat decoration that would go out on our front lawn every single year. And I'm pretty sure the reason we had it and used it constantly was because this decoration specifically was like passed on through the family for 80 years. So it's kind of like a family heirloom cat decoration. But I don't think we ever used it for like superstitious reasons. And what I found out through research, which blew my mind, was that people were being warned that if you have a pet black cat, to keep them indoors on Halloween, just in case there are any Halloween pranksters prowling about. If they don't like black cats, a lot of the times they will do something terrible to them. Because honestly, there are some very evil people in this world that don't care about the life of animals or even humans. But let's move on to something lighter and talk about some of the most famous black cats in media. First, we have Salem from Sabrina the Teenage Witch. We also have Sylvester Babysitter from Looney Tunes. We have Felix the cat. We have Binks from Hocus Pocus. We have the cat from The Cat in the Hat, but he's sort of black and white. We have the cat from Coraline, which we all love. We have Lucifer from Cinderella. And I just want to say, I didn't even realize his name was Lucifer. Like, why would they name him that? And then we have Catwoman, which I don't know if she really counts in this list. But it just shows you that black cats really have been celebrated in movies and TV shows. And lastly, I want to talk about this sort of eerie story. It's called The Visitor. This is about a girl who used to babysit her neighbor's cat. It was this elderly woman who had a very old black cat, but it was so friendly and cuddly. And one day it unfortunately passed away, and this girl was just so heartbroken. But on the night he died, she looked out her window at night and saw him sitting on the fence watching her. Except it had pure white glowing eyes. And every night going forward, she would see him out there. It was almost as if he was protecting her, but she just couldn't get over how eerie he looked with those white eyes. And this wasn't a creepypasta, this was like a true story that someone told online. And I've actually heard a lot of stories about how people's pets like come and watch over them after they've passed away, which I find really sweet, but also pure white glowing eyes is kind of scary too. This is the disappearance of Stephen Damon. On Halloween of 1955 in New York, a woman named Marilyn DeMann took her 2-year-old son Stephen and 7-month-old daughter Pamela to the supermarket. Now, she left both of her children outside of the grocery store while she went shopping. She was just doing a very brief errand, and her youngest daughter was actually in a baby carriage because she was only 7 months old. But minutes later, when the mother returned from running her errand, she saw that her children were gone. The carriage with her daughter inside it was found a block away, but Stephen was never seen again. So for some reason, her youngest daughter was completely unharmed just down the road. So it's strange how she was left there just fine, but Stephen was just nowhere to be seen. The police were investigating this case and weren't able to find anything, so it went cold. But decades later, in 2009, a Michigan man came forward to police saying that he himself was Stephen, the boy that went missing back in the 50s. But the police did a DNA test on this random man and they found out he was lying. But nevertheless, it was very strange how this man really truly believed he was Stephen. So yeah, this case remains a complete mystery. No one really knows what happened. There were no witnesses to see what went on outside the grocery store. And it just blows my mind. I mean, I would never leave my young kids outside on their own. I know things were so different back then. Things were a lot safer, if you can believe it or not. But there are just too many evil people in this world. I would never leave my kids alone. And when I was little, I would never leave my mom's side. Like, remember that horrible feeling you got whenever you lost your parents in a store? Like, you literally thought you were going to be lost forever. Alright, this next disappearance story is called The Girl That Followed the Pumpkin Man. This happened back in the 80s on Halloween morning. There was this mother who had these 2 daughters. One was 7 years old and the other one was 4. They didn't have school because Halloween fell on a Saturday, and the mother wanted to quickly go to the store to pick up candy for later on. So she told the girls to stay inside and just watch movies while she was away. She only expected to be about 30 minutes. When she got back and walked into the house, she saw that her youngest daughter was crying hysterically and noticed that her older daughter was nowhere to be seen. And when she asked her younger daughter what happened to her older sister, she got the eeriest response.
"She followed the pumpkin man into the forest,"
she said as she pointed to the window looking into their backyard. Their house backed onto a very large forest, and the girls were always told to never go into it without an adult present. Now, obviously this mother was extremely confused about what her daughter was telling her, and when she tried to get more information, she found out that there was literally this man standing in the forest with a pumpkin over his head, probably some sort of Halloween costume, and he was like beckoning the girls to follow him into the forest. Now, the youngest one was too afraid, but the older daughter wanted to go because she was curious. Now, don't worry, there's actually a relatively good outcome to this story. The girl was missing for about 2 days, and then police eventually located her. When they asked her what happened, she also said,
"I followed the pumpkin man and got lost in here."
And to this day, they have no idea who this person was and what his motives were, because the girl was found completely unharmed. And guys, this might just be a creepypasta because I couldn't find any like real dates or real like newspaper articles about it. So if you guys know if it's real or fake, definitely comment down below. But this Halloween, if you see a man standing somewhere with a pumpkin mask on and he's doing this motion, don't follow him. don't follow him. Alright, so this next missing case is called Vanished Without a Trace, and this is completely real as well. To this day, no one knows what happened to a girl named Cindy Song. She was a grad student at Penn State University who disappeared without a trace after leaving a Halloween party after midnight in 2001. Now, on her way home from this Halloween party, she actually stopped at one of her friend's houses. It was in the early morning, probably like 1 or 2 in the morning. She was wearing a bunny costume, and apparently she got a ride home back to her house at 4 a.m. Now, here's the strangest part that cops just can't understand. She managed to get inside her home safely, and she dropped off her belongings, including her backpack, her cell phone. She even removed her false eyelashes. So she literally got home from this party just fine, got into her house, and was literally getting ready to go to bed. But after this night, she was never seen again, and nobody knows what happened. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, they found no suspects, so this case is completely cold. It's just so strange how all of her stuff was in her house, all of her doors were locked. It was like she just disappeared into thin air. So yeah, I guess the moral of the story here is definitely be careful when you're going home on Halloween, especially if you're alone or it's super late at night. And I guess that also applies to generally any night. But yeah, this story was extremely sad, and it's especially sad when you don't have any answers. This last story is called The Ghost Blanket Mystery. I'm not sure if this one is real or not. It definitely could be. This story takes place back in the 90s on Halloween. There was this group of 3 teenagers who went out trick-or-treating around 9 p.m. and were never seen again. Now, around midnight, their parents were obviously very worried, so they called the police and told them that their kids had not come home. Now, because these were teenagers who had gone out, the police told the parents to kind of just wait a bit longer because maybe their kids were out pulling pranks, were up to no good, or maybe out partying. So the police told the parents to wait until the morning to call them. Well, the morning came around and their kids were still not home, so the police decided to start an investigation. Basically, the entire neighborhood was involved in the search, but they couldn't locate them anywhere. So the police started interviewing everybody in the area to see if they saw anything weird the night before. And here's the eeriest part. Almost all the people the police were interviewing saw the same weird thing on the Halloween night. Parents had noticed a tall person dressed in one of those ghost blanket costumes. They said the figure was tall enough to look like whoever it was well over 30 years old. And it was just like following people around, watching people trick or treat, but they never walked up to houses to get any candy. Apparently, some parents even walked up to this weird person asking them what they were doing. Because as parents, when you see something weird, especially when you're with your kids like trick-or-treating, you're gonna want to confront it and make sure everything's okay. But anyone who talked to this person said it never responded. And it's crazy how many people pointed out this mysterious figure to the police, but when the police went to find this suspect, they had no luck. And this whole thing is still a mystery to this day. These kids were never found. There was no evidence. It was like this person who was wearing this strange ghost costume just completely disappeared. It's always so tough reading about cold cases because when you don't have answers, it's so bothersome. Mazes can be made out of hedges, corn, wood, or mirrors, and they can incite feelings of panic, excitement, or serenity. Now, mazes have been a part of our culture for thousands of years, and some people wonder why. The first mazes that were ever created were actually called labyrinths, and they had a single winding path not meant to confuse or puzzle anyone that was walking through it. So the very first labyrinths that were ever invented had no dead ends, had no deceiving paths, it was just one path. There was only one way you could go. And one of the most famous labyrinths is called the Cretan Labyrinth, which housed the terrifying Minotaur at its center. And if you don't know what a Minotaur is, it's basically this mythical creature that was portrayed in classical times as having a head and tail of a bull and the body of a man. So imagine running into this creature while you're walking through a maze. For some reason, back in those times, they would always have one in the center of their maze. Now, obviously these creatures weren't real, but they would either have like statues or they would show it in paintings as being in the center of a maze. Now, there was this very weird tradition in Germany where when boys were approaching adulthood, they would have to go through a maze. And that was kind of like their change from being a boy to a man. During the Middle Ages, as kings and queens built up elaborate gardens, they would often include some sort of hedge maze as a diversion for themselves and guests. And since they did that, hedge mazes have become a very popular thing. In 1690, the oldest surviving hedge maze was created in the Hampton Court maze in Greater London. And this maze still exists to this day since the 1600s. The hedges used in the creation of mazes are taller than most visitors who dare enter. Now, the word maze actually dates back to the 13th century, and it's derived from the word delirium. Now, obviously delirium means like confused, you feel sort of out of place and weird, and that's how you're supposed to feel when you're in a maze. Now, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I think of a hedge maze, I instantly think of Harry Potter. That part of the movie actually scared me so much as a kid, and honestly, in my opinion, I think that's the scariest part of the whole entire series. And then when I think of the word labyrinth, I think of the David Bowie movie. I know every single song in that movie by heart. I love that movie. Now let's specifically talk about when corn mazes were first invented. The history of mazes in cornfields goes back to 1993. The first corn maze was built in the United States at Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania. Now this very first corn maze was only about 3 acres wide, and it had about 1.92 miles of path. And since then, corn mazes have been a tradition all over the world, especially around fall season. Now for some reason, I thought corn mazes have been around since like the early 1900s, but the first one was only created in the 90s? What? Now I wanted to tell you guys today about this very, very creepy corn maze. Now this is probably just a creepypasta, I would assume, but it's still terrifying. This story is called The Corn Maze That Kept Changing. Now this story was actually written in the perspective of a cop. He was new to his job and he was working in this small rural town in Pennsylvania. And one day he got dispatched to a very unexplained call. Since he lived in a rural town, they had plenty of corn mazes, haunted houses, and hay rides that time of year in the fall. And after October 31st, farmers began to clear out their cornfields. And usually when farmers start clearing out their cornfields for winter, they will find interesting lost items that people had dropped while they were in the maze. You know, they find things like hats, bags, jewelry, scarves, mitts, all kinds of just random things that people would have. So it's very common for farmers to just find missing items. And usually when farmers find these things, they wouldn't call the police. They would either throw them out or have like a lost and found bin. Well, one day this police department got this very strange call from a farmer who said he had found something very horrible while cleaning out his cornfield. So basically, this new cop was dispatched to go and investigate. When he got there, he walked into the cornfield with the farmer, and as they were walking, he asked the farmer what he had found. And the man replied to this cop saying,
"Oh, I found a skeleton."
The farmer said that at first he thought that maybe it was just like a Halloween decoration, maybe it was fake, but when he got closer, he realized that this skeleton was definitely human. Now the cop was skeptical at first until the farmer brought him to the exact spot where he found it in the corn maze. They both looked down at this shallow like hole in the ground that had this skeleton inside of it. So because the officer saw this, he told the farmer to go back to his house while he called for backup, because obviously they didn't want the farmer involved in like tampering with evidence. So before the farmer walked back to the farmhouse, he told the cop,
"I'm sure my wife is waiting on the front porch for my return. We're gonna have some breakfast and you can come grab me if you need anything."
So this officer was just standing over the skeleton and took out his phone to call for backup. But he realized he didn't have any service, so he decided to walk back to the farmhouse to call from this farmer's phone. Right as he was about to walk back, he felt someone grab his shoulder. So he spun around expecting to see that the farmer was still there, but when he turned, there was no one there. A sudden rush of chills went down his spine and he turned back to continue towards the farmhouse. But to his surprise, he was face to face with corn stalks that hadn't been there before, and they were nearly 8 feet tall. So he spun around, and all around him were these corn stalks right in front of him. And he could no longer see the farmhouse, which was so weird because they hadn't walked very far into the maze, and the farmhouse was definitely still in sight. But suddenly it was like the corn maze had changed and was all around him. Almost half hour passed of him trying to find his way out of the cornfield, but he kept finding dead ends. And every time he turned around to look back at the path he had just walked down, it was suddenly gone. So he knew the cornfield was changing almost every second, and he was losing track of time of how long he had been in there. So he stopped to catch his breath, and his heart almost stopped when he looked down at the ground to see the same skeleton lying in the shallow grave. So clearly he was right back where he started, which was so frustrating because he felt like he was walking for almost an hour. So he sat on the ground completely frustrated, put his head in his hands, but when he looked up again, he saw the farmhouse in the distance. He walked right up to the farmhouse, and the farmer was standing on his porch, and the farmer asked him,
"Officer, did you manage to call for backup?"
So So he told the farmer how embarrassed he was because it took him so long to just get out of the cornfield. He said he didn't mean to be gone for over an hour, but the farmer just shook his head and smiled and responded,
I only left you about a minute ago. I don't know why you would be embarrassed about that.
And that's how the story ended. So I was reading a lot of people's comments. They were saying that the farmer sounds really sketchy, like it sounds like he sort of knows what goes on in the cornfield. And I guess that skeleton was there because it was a previous person who could not escape the cornfield, maybe? This almost reminds me of that movie In the Tall Grass. If you guys have seen that movie, you'll kind of see the similarities. But yeah, I definitely thought it was kind of an interesting story, and especially around this time of year with corn mazes. I don't know if I want to go in one after this. So let's get right into our first story. This is called The Doorbell Rang After Midnight. This is about a teenager who was babysitting two kids while their parents were out at a Halloween party. He took the kids trick-or-treating for about an hour and then spent the rest of the evening handing out candy to kids that came by the house. Now around 9 p.m. or so, he was completely out of candy. So he just put the kids he was babysitting to bed and assumed that no one else would be coming to the door. I don't know about you guys, but my parents always stopped handing out candy around like 9:30 or 10 p.m. at night on Halloween. They always told us that if anyone else came to the door after those hours, they were probably like older teenagers, older adults that just wanted to cause trouble. So they always told us, like, girls, after 9 p.m., do not open the door. Anyways, let's get back to the story. So this guy put the kids to bed and was just watching TV. Now, it's important to note in this story that this particular house he was babysitting at had light sensors on the porch. So for example, if anyone ever walked onto the porch, the lights would turn on because of these motion sensors. Well, around midnight, this babysitter was just sitting on the couch watching TV when the doorbell rang. And he knew right away it wasn't the parents because they had a key to the house and would normally just walk in. So he instantly thought that it must just be some teenagers out on Halloween trying to cause some trouble. He decided not to answer it, but about 30 seconds later, the doorbell rang again. So he took a deep breath, got up, and walked over to the door and slowly opened it. What he saw was the silhouette of two kids standing on the porch in the darkness. They were holding out their Halloween bags towards him, and for some reason the motion lights hadn't turned on. So the babysitter assumed the lights must have been like out of batteries because of all the trick-or-treaters he had that night. So the two kids standing in the darkness on the porch suddenly said,
"Trick or treat!"
at the very same time, but something sounded very off about their voices. They almost sounded inhuman. So the babysitter told them that he was completely out of candy and that they shouldn't be out at night this late. But the kids just stood there in the darkness on his porch. He was unable to see their faces.
"Okay, go home now,"
he told them. He started gesturing towards the sidewalk, but they still just stood there in the darkness on the porch. He started to get spooked and closed the door, and they stood there on the porch for what seemed like minutes and minutes, and then they slowly turned around and walked away. Once they were gone and he had no sight of them anymore, he walked out on the porch, and the second he walked out there, the motion sensor lights turned on, so they were working. His heart stopped when he realized why the lights may not have detected them. Maybe they weren't human. Maybe they were something else. And the second I heard this story, I instantly thought of like Blackeyed Children, and I've done a whole video on them. They're scary. But anyways, guys, that's why you should never babysit on Halloween. So the next story I want to call you is actually just titled The Babysitter. Not very creative, but this is actually a classic horror story based off an urban legend that I feel like a lot of you have probably heard before. Back when I was growing up, people told this story to me all the time, and they actually even made a horror movie based off of this urban legend called When a Stranger Calls, and this movie came out in like early 2000s, I think. But here's how this urban legend goes. There was this young girl who really needed a job, and she was able to find a babysitting job for a couple who lived in a large, isolated old house. The couple wanted to go see a movie that night, so they left their 3 kids in the hands of this babysitter. The babysitter put the children to bed, and when it got late, she went downstairs to watch some television. She was just getting comfortable when she heard the phone ringing, and when she answered it, all she heard was this heavy breathing followed by a man's voice asking,
"Have you checked on the children?"
Freaked out, she hung up the phone, trying to convince herself that it must have been some like practical joke that was being played on her. Maybe it was one of her friends that were prank calling her. her it couldn't have been real, or so she kept telling herself. She went back to watching television, but about 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. She picked it up and heard hysterical laughter from the other end. Then the same voice asked,
"Why haven't you checked on the children?"
So once again, the babysitter slammed down the phone. She was feeling so afraid, and she decided to call the police. The operator at the police station told the girl that if the man called again, she should try to keep him on the phone, and that way the police could track where he was calling from. A few minutes later, the phone rang a third time, and when the babysitter answered it, she heard the heavy breathing once again, and the voice on the other line said,
"You should really check on the children."
The babysitter listened to him laughing hysterically for a long time, long enough for the police to be able to see where he was coming from. She hung up the phone and the police called her. The operator was frantic, and she told her, "Get out of the house now. The calls are coming from your upstairs phone." So she knew right away that whoever was calling her from inside the house. The girl ran out of the house, and when the police got there, they searched the house and found the two children upstairs hiding in the closet. The two kids were crying uncontrollably, and when the police went into the parents' bedroom, the back window was wide open and the curtains were blowing in the breeze. And that's how this story ends, and there's kind of different versions of it that people tell, but this story freaked me out so much as a kid, and it also kind of made me not want to babysit, because that's really scary. And the last story I want to talk about is called The Witch Is Here. Now what's so creepy about this story is that apparently it's a true story. This is about a girl who was babysitting her two nieces. One was just 3 months old, and the other one was 5 years old. Now this 5-year-old had a room right across from the baby's room. So there was a hallway, and the 5-year-old was here and the baby was here. So they could like see into each other's room. The babysitter was lying in the baby's room around midnight, and suddenly she heard the 5-year-old start screaming in her room. So obviously the babysitter jumped out of bed, ran into this 5-year-old's room, and she saw this little girl sitting upright in her bed, and over she was saying,
"The witch is here. The witch is here. The witch is here."
And she was pointing into the baby's room. So the babysitter tried to calm her down, and the girl was able to fall back asleep. And when she walked back into the baby's room, she saw the baby sitting up in her crib playing patty cake with no one there. She was literally playing patty cake to just like nothing. How does a 3-month-old know how to play patty cake by themselves? So this completely freaked out the babysitter, because obviously she wondered, is there a witch actually here? Like this creepy spirit that I can't see? And since that day, she was unable to babysit ever again. So the first strange Halloween tradition is about looking in the mirror. There's a superstition in England that says if a man or woman stares into a mirror in a dark room on Halloween, they will see the face of their future wife or husband in the background. So people will literally sit in a dark room, stare into a mirror, and if they see like a figment of a face in the background, they're like,
"Oh, that's my future husband."
But it also says that if you see a skull instead of a face, that means you're gonna die before you marry. So the mirror kind of tells your future, or so they believed. So you're either gonna die or you're gonna get married. I actually have an old vintage Halloween card from the 1920s that talks about this exact tradition. Let me go grab it so I can show you. So here it is. I will read it for you up close. It says, "If in the mirror your lover is seen, you'll surely be happy on Halloween." So it really just shows you how superstitious they were back then. And during my research, I also found out that people like to do this on October 28th specifically. I was reading this whole article from this woman who was writing about her childhood and how she always did that a few days before Halloween. I feel like I want to try this on the vlog channel, even though I'm already married, but still. What if I see a skull? Alright, the next Halloween tradition is from Austria. On the night of the 31st in Austria, people would leave bread and water out on a table with a lamp to welcome and nourish the souls of the dead. Because as you guys probably know, people believe that on Halloween, the dead are able to like walk among us. The barrier is broken. So in Austria, they believe if these spirits are hungry or thirsty, they have something to like eat or drink. It's actually very nice, to be honest. The next tradition is from the Czech Republic. One old Czech custom is to place chairs around the fireplace on November 2nd. So they would basically place one chair for each living family member, and they would also place a chair for all the departed ones. So you would literally sit in front of your fireplace beside the spirits of your dead loved ones. People also visit the graves of the departed and adorn them with flowers and candles on this day. So it's interesting to know that they do this a couple days after Halloween. The next tradition is from Germany, and this one is so strange to me. Basically, some Germans hide all of the knives in their house between October 30th and November 8th. But they do this especially on Halloween night, so that the spirits of the dead wouldn't have any access to them. Because when they're walking the earth, walking through your house possibly, you don't want them to have access to sharp and scary things. Guys, please comment down below if your family or you are from any of these places. I want to know if you do any of this stuff. In Germany, they also have the tradition of going to Burg Frankenstein Castle. Some believe that this castle is the very building that inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And when people go there, they basically dress up as their favorite classic monster. I want to go here so bad. The next Halloween tradition is from Ireland. So basically on Halloween, people there would eat a fruitcake. And they called this fruitcake a barmbrack. And on Halloween, bakers would hide a ring, a piece of cloth, and a stick inside the fruitcake. And then they would slice up the cake and give each person a piece. Now, if you got any of these three things, it meant something about you. So I have a little list here to tell you. It says whoever got the ring would marry soon. Whoever got the cloth would enter the clergy. What's a clergy? Should I know what that is? And whoever got the stick would remain single forever. Wow. Sometimes bakers would even hide a coin inside this fruitcake. And if you got that in your slice, it meant that you were going to be wealthy in the future. Now, health laws now don't allow bakers to put all these things inside the cake because it's not necessarily good for you, and if people accidentally swallow it, that would be horrible. But it does say that people still will hide the ring inside the fruitcake. In Ireland, they would also sprinkle holy water on farm animals to ward off evil spirits. Imagine just going up to all the animals and like spraying water all in their faces. They'd be like,
What the heck is happening? Are you going crazy or something?
Next, we have a Halloween tradition in Scotland. Now, these two traditions actually involve food items. On Halloween, young women would peel an apple in one long piece and throw it over their left shoulder. And when they threw it, apparently the way it landed on the ground, it would spell out their future husband's initials. So maybe you threw your apple peel and it looks like a J on the ground. Maybe your future husband is Jeremy. Or if you threw it over your shoulder and it looks like an A, maybe his name is Alexander. So that's a pretty interesting Halloween tradition. The other tradition is to place two hazelnuts side by side in the fire. One hazelnut was supposed to represent yourself, and the other hazelnut was supposed to represent the person that you love. The lore says that if they both catch fire and burn silently, the two will be married. But if they jump apart in the fire and crackle, that means you will never be together. Wow. It seems like a lot of places around the world have these like superstitious traditions. Next, we have a tradition in Mexico. This is called Day of the Dead. From November 1st to November 2nd, Mexico and parts of Latin America celebrate Day of the Dead to honor those who have passed away. It is believed that the gates of heaven open up at midnight on October 31st, and the souls of children return to Earth to be reunited with their families for 24 hours. And then apparently on November 2nd, the souls of the adults come down from heaven to join in on the festivities. Next, we have a Halloween tradition in Romania. People from all around the world flock to celebrate Halloween at Vlad the Impaler's home at Bran Castle in Transylvania, Romania. Now, people like to call Vlad the Impaler the real Dracula, and he was born back in 1431. There are a number of guides and inclusive travel packages in Romania that offer tours and parties at Count Dracula's castle for Halloween. I feel like that's like my dream place to go on Halloween. Anybody else? And lastly, we have a tradition from China. In China, the Halloween festival is known as Tangche. Food and water are placed in front of photographs of family members who have departed, while bonfires and lanterns are lit in order to light the paths of the spirits as they travel the earth on Halloween night. But before I get into those scary stories, I really wanted to briefly talk about Halloween costume history. I did a whole video before on how scary the old vintage costumes looked back then, and that was because most people used to hand make them themselves, and no offense to those people, sometimes looked a little bit too scary. But there's actually a real reason behind why we even wear Halloween costumes to begin with. Back in the day, to essentially trick the ghosts on Halloween, people would wear scary costumes as a disguise, so they would be mistaken for spirits themselves and left alone by the dead. Because, like I said before, people believed that on Halloween the veil between the living and the dead was broken, and the dead would like walk among us. So people thought that if they looked like the creepy spirits and literally dressed up like them, the spirits wouldn't recognize them as humans and would leave them alone. I literally had no idea about this. I thought that people just wore costumes because it was fun, which is what it's become nowadays, but back then they were literally trying to disguise themselves from the ghosts. There's also a reason why black and orange are like the colors of Halloween. Like, people wear black and orange makeup and Halloween costumes and black and orange decor everywhere, and those two colors started because apparently black represents the death of summer and orange represents the autumn harvest season. So those two together are Halloween in a nutshell. And that's why we always associate those two color combinations with Halloween. Isn't it interesting how every holiday has like color combos? Like Valentine's Day is like red and pink, Christmas is green and red, Halloween is black and orange, Easter is like pastel colors. I love it. So the first story I want to talk about is this man who thought he saw black-eyed children come to his door on Halloween. Now this story is very similar to the babysitting story that I told you guys a couple videos ago. So I'm going to talk about it very briefly just because it's so similar, but oh my gosh, this one is scarier. So it's about this guy who was handing out candy on Halloween. It got really late, so he decided to go to bed. Right before he went to bed, he heard a knock on his door. When he opened the door, he saw two children standing on his porch. But he says they weren't wearing costumes and they were the strangest children he had ever seen. He said their skin was waxy and ghostly white. Their eyes were completely black. Their teeth were jagged and were almost too big to fit inside their mouths. And they were just wearing normal clothes, plaid shirts, jeans, shoes. So confused, the man asked them,
"What are you two supposed to be? Some sort of monsters?"
And the children's faces turned into this giant grin as they said,
"No. Today we're dressed as humans."
So he slammed the door, ran inside absolutely terrified, and they started pounding on his door for what seemed like half an hour. And then suddenly it stopped and he never saw those kids ever again. So yeah, just look out for black-eyed children on Halloween. Be careful, guys. This next story is called the Halloween costume. This is about a 10-year-old girl who was very sick with a fever on Halloween, and the doctor had given her mother strict instructions to make sure that she stayed in bed to get better. Now, unfortunately, there was a Halloween party going on downstairs and she had to miss out on all the fun. So while she was sick, lying in bed trying to sleep, she could hear people laughing downstairs, she could hear the music downstairs. That would be horrible. Now, as she lied in her bed, she had this very strange feeling. Dark shadows gathered in the corners of her room as she tried to tell herself that they were all in her head. And suddenly there was a knock on her bedroom door and the door slightly creaked open to reveal her uncle's face. He was just checking up on her to make sure that she was okay.
"How's the party going?"
she asked him.
"It's good. I'm actually just about to put on my Halloween costume to scare everybody out of their wits."
"Is it really scary? Can I see it?"
"Yeah, it's extremely scary and it might scare you too much."
But she pleaded with him to see his scary Halloween costume once he had put it on. So he finally agreed.
"Alright, once I get dressed up, I'll come in and show you my costume, but you have to promise that you won't be too scared."
So she nodded and he left the room. Suddenly, everything seemed eerily quiet and she could no longer hear anything coming from downstairs. The room was very dark, the shadows in the corners of her room were growing again. And just then, she heard the sound of her bedroom door opening and scuffling on her floor. And she noticed this figure in the shadows of her room. The figure was so small, no higher than a table. It was crouched on the ground with its back turned to her. It almost looked like it was covered in this black cloak. The figure slowly turned to face her, and she was trying her best not to show how frightened she was because she told her uncle she would not be afraid of his costume. But the face was hideous. It was a dead, pale face with a long pointed nose. There were no eyes, was just small black holes in the mask. And her uncle was right. His costume was too scary and she actually began to panic. She was staring at the horrible mask as it got closer and closer. It was basically right beside her bed, so she couldn't take it anymore and threw the covers over her head. And just before she was about to scream, she heard a knock on her bedroom door.
Okay, I'm ready. Can I come in now?
It was her uncle at the door. And that's how the story ends. So clearly whatever creature was in her bedroom was not her uncle in the costume. So that story was definitely kind of creepy and I feel so bad for this girl. Like, she's sick and she has a monster in her room. All right, and the last creepypasta is called The Mask That Stayed. And this is the one about the costume that would not come off. This story is about a kid who went to a secondhand shop to get a Halloween costume. He was searching through bins of old masks when finally he came across one that he was instantly drawn to. It was this red skull looking mask that had this large smiling mouth with sharp teeth. And what was strange was when he brought it up to the cashier took one look at it and was like,
"Oh, that one. You can have that one for free."
And as strange as that was, the boy was just happy he was able to get a free Halloween costume. And I don't know about you guys, but if a cashier looked at the mask I was trying to buy like that, I probably wouldn't buy it. He went to a Halloween party that night, proudly wearing his new mask around, hoping it would scare some of his friends. And he got so many compliments that night about how freaky it was. People even said it looked too real. That night when he got home, he went into the washroom to shower and tried to take his mask off. But the thing is, it wouldn't budge. And he found it strange because he didn't put the mask on with glue or anything. He literally just put the elastic loops around his ears. But now it wasn't coming off, and he was tugging at his mask on his face for what seemed like ages. He eventually had to stand in the shower in the hot water hoping that would help. And after a while, it finally started to peel off. And when he looked in the mirror afterwards, his face was so red it almost looked like it was completely covered in rashes and blisters. He went to bed and in the morning his face felt so itchy and sore. And when he felt his cheeks, he got so worried because his skin felt thick and bumpy and just rubbery and strange. He ran into the washroom and as soon as he looked into the mirror, his heart stopped. The red mask was growing back on his face, poking through his skin slowly and forming once again. How horrible would that be? And that's how the story ends. So it's almost like even though he can peel off the mask, it will just grow back through his skin anyways. Imagine always being a red skeleton. No, thank you. And before I end this video, I really want to show you this comic style story that I found online that's so creepy, and here's how it goes. "Good night, pumpkin, sleep tight." So this father is like tucking in his child and she says, "But dad, there's a monster in the closet." So he walks over to the closet and he's like, "I promise you there are no monsters here." And then he opens the closet and sitting there is his daughter and she says, "Dad, there's someone in my bed." So it's like, which one's the actual monster? The one in the closet or the one in the bed? What the heck?
Children lost, ensnared by a witch's binding spell. Jessiie, the awakened soul, yearns to escape and find a new home. Dare you join her and explore more?